Welcome back to Homesteading with the Zimmermans, where we work hard and play hard on our little corner of land in Iowa. My husband and I were born and raised Old Order Mennonite, or horse and buggy Mennonite, as some refer to them as. And although we are no longer part of that culture or community, we are intentional about passing on the old-fashioned skills of our childhood to the next generation. Welcome back, everyone. In today's video, we are going to be making hamburger buns. And I've gotten a couple questions where people have asked if I use yeast or yeast breads at all anymore, because I've shared a couple sourdough bread recipes. So what I'm going to share today is a very quick and easy recipe on how to make hamburger buns, and I'm gonna give a couple variations and share all the ways that our family uses these hamburger buns. But what I'm doing now is making cheese. I've got my hands in the cheese pot and decided I might as well film the intro while I'm standing here stirring my cheese curds. So I was gonna get started filming right away this morning the hamburger buns, and then when we got done with chores, the kids said there's no more empty jars to put milk in, and there's also no more room in the milk fridge. So this morning's milk went straight from the cows into my milk bucket, into my cheese pot, and I didn't want to risk contaminating my Gouda cheese with yeast by working on a yeast dough at the same time I am making cheese. So I'm gonna finish the cheese, and then we're going to put it in the press and move it aside, and then we're gonna start on making the hamburger buns. And this cheese, this is ready to go into the press. And this is going to be probably, I'm guessing, a 4-pound wheel of Gouda cheese that we will put into our cheese cave, and we'll let it age. And maybe this winter I'll do some cheese videos. But right now, I've got to get these curds into the press. Now that the cheese is in the press, we are going to move over to the dining room table and get our hamburger buns started. Okay, now it's time for the hamburger buns. If you're anything like me, hamburgers are a staple for summer meals. But my biggest problem is keeping hamburger buns on hand. Oftentimes we'll just use bread because I almost always have sliced bread on hand. And my problem with store-bought hamburger buns is if they're not fresh, like 2 or 3 days old max, then they're no good. They're dry and crumbly, and even if you buy them and store them in your freezer, my family just finds them very, very lacking. They get very dry, and honestly, they taste like eating cardboard to me. So this hamburger bun recipe is from my sister-in-law. And you only need, well, it's gonna take me a little longer because I'm filming, but if you get these hamburgers started about 45 minutes before you want to serve them, probably figure an hour because you want to cool them. So all you really need is an hour of time, and a lot of that time is a hands-off time where the dough is rising and then baking. So if we decide we want to have hamburgers and we want to eat at 6, as long as it's still 5 o'clock, I can whip up the hamburgers and the buns all together and we will be good. And my family's even gotten so spoiled that if I make the hamburger buns and they're already cool before it's time to serve the hamburgers, they might complain a little bit because fresh, warm hamburger buns with a burger straight off of the grill is what they have learned to prefer. So first things first, look at me. See how organized I am today because I wanted to stay out of the kitchen where the cheese is in the press And so I gathered all of my ingredients. And one of the things that will speed up any bread making or any process, is it sourdough or yeast, is heat. So the first thing we want to do is we want to heat all our liquids together because that'll help the yeast be more active. So we've got 1 cup of milk. And don't forget, I will have in my description, I'll have a link to a printable recipe where you can print it and have it and, you know, put it into a folder or whatever. 3/4 a cup of water. I've got 1/2 a cup of melted butter. It doesn't have to be melted. It was just my butter was in the freezer and I needed to soften it anyway, so I ended up melting it. 1/2 a cup of melted butter. 1 teaspoon of salt. And then I had to cut my gallon jar of honey so that I can get the last bits of honey out of this gallon jar. We need 3 tablespoons of honey. That's 1, 2, and 3. Okay, I use butter. You can use lard, melted lard, or melted tallow, or a liquid oil if you would rather use that than butter, but I think butter gives them a much better flavor. So we're just gonna heat this. My honey is very sticky there in the corner because the milk was cold, so we're gonna heat this until it's warm. So in the meantime, while we wait for that to warm, you've probably noticed there's some construction going on outside. That this is going to be a covered patio, and we are doing most of the work ourselves. So it's been an ongoing project most of the summer, but the roof is up, and this area out here that's covered is going to be my outdoor cooking space, or I should say our outdoor cooking space, because Elvin's smoker will be out there, and my camp chef, I'll do all my canning out there, and we're super excited to have it all done. Our house sits up really high, so we had to bring in a lot of fill, and the yard is going to end up being put into 2 different levels so that we have some flat space instead of having one long slanted yard. I'll take you out there real quick and show you what it looks like from the outside. So this is all going to be my outdoor cooking space. This over here is going to be for a fire pit and chairs. There's my laundry room door, so that the laundry will connect that way to the patio. Anyway, so there's the garden, and then here's where we've had to bring fill in because the house is all the way up there. So all these piles of dirt here will help us get a more gentle access to the garden so we don't have to hike uphill so far. And we'll put a retaining wall and make 2 flat spaces to the yard. And this is what this looks like down here. And we're thinking we'll probably have to move that little sugar maple tree, just move him out towards the road a little more. Okay, I'm gonna call this warm enough, but I'm also going to stick my thermometer in there so that I can, so for those of you that haven't done this before, kind of have an idea how warm it should be. You want it about 105 to 110 degrees. Anything warmer than that could kill your yeast and your bread won't rise. So now, of course, because I ran outside, I've got this a little too hot, so I'm just gonna let it cool down a bit. But the kids are back in school. The kids started school last week, and for those of you that are new here, our children attend a small private Christian school. And this year was our 14th consecutive year of attending that school. Our 2 older daughters graduated from there. Our son-in-law graduated from the private Christian school. So you may not see quite as much of the children in the videos this winter, but they are still very much part of the homestead. And we have we've slowly been adjusting to getting all of our morning chores done before they go off to school. So we've been getting up at about 6, and it takes us a good hour to milk the 2 cows and take care of all the other animals and take care of the milk and feed the calves. So by 7 o'clock, we're usually back in the house and ready to have breakfast. And then they are off to school around 8. The school is very local to us, so they don't have a long commute at all. Okay, so this has cooled down a bit. This is all the ingredients except the flour and yeast. All right, so I've got my yeast. I always store my yeast in the freezer because I buy a big container at a time and I do not use it very fast. So I store my yeast in the freezer to keep it fresh and active. And this is instant yeast, dry instant yeast, and I'm gonna use 2 tablespoons. And we're gonna mix that instant yeast into our warm liquids and honey. Now we're just gonna let that sit for a little bit and let the yeast dissolve. So now you can see that the yeast has dissolved, and I'm not even sure that this is a necessary step with instant yeast, but because this is the way my grandma's always done it, and this is the way my mom's done it, I always let my yeast sit for 2 or 3 minutes or until it gets foamy like this, and then I know that my yeast is working. So next we're gonna add 2 cups of all-purpose flour, and we're just gonna mix this in really well. And true to my character, or true to my nature, I have a hard time judging the size of bowl that we need. So now that we've mixed the first 2 cups of flour in and our dough is smooth, we're gonna add 2 more cups of flour. And I'm doing this entire batch by hand so that those of you that don't have a fancy mixer like mine can feel like you're included as well. So now we've got a total of 4 cups of flour. So our dough's starting to get a little more sticky. It's almost time for me to go at it with my hands. So I'm gonna add another 1/2 cup of flour, and we're gonna work this in. And before I stick my hands in the dough here, I'm going to measure out some more flour and just set it here in case I need some more. Now my sister-in-law, she says that you can use it up to 1/2 whole wheat flour. So I'm just gonna start working this flour in, and I'm going to just scrape along the sides. So I'm just gonna scrape along the sides here. Get that all off. And we're gonna start kneading this dough. So kneading, this is how you knead dough by hand, or this is how I do. This is how my mom and grandma taught me. And It's hard not to want to add too much more flour when you're kneading your dough by hand, because in the mixer, you would just let it stick to the paddles a little bit. So you're gonna have to be okay with it sticking to your hands a little bit, because this is going to be a sticky dough. And the reason you want to be careful not to add too much flour is because flour will give you a dry and crumbly, too much flour will give you a dry and crumbly end result. So you're kneading it to develop the gluten, and the gluten is what helps your bread stick together and be soft. So kneading is just really folding your dough and smashing it flat. So you fold it and smash it flat. When you're kneading, you want to use the palms of your hands instead of your fingers, or you want to focus on using the palms of your hands more than you want to use your fingers. And I always say, when you're learning to make bread, it's a very good idea to make bread weekly or twice weekly and to knead it by hand, because kneading by hand is a wonderful teacher on what your yeast bread or even your sourdough bread should feel like. I had close to 5 cups of flour in here by the time I was done kneading it, and that's okay. Don't ever get hung up on the amount of flour that a recipe, especially a yeast dough recipe, calls for, because everybody measures flour so differently. And if you feel like yours needs more flour, then it probably does. And if your end result gets too dry and crumbly, then you know that you should have added less flour and done more kneading. All right, we're gonna call that good. We're gonna put it back in the dish, and we're gonna cover it with saran wrap to trap the moisture in there, because humidity and heat is what makes dough rise. So now we're gonna let it set for about 10 minutes, and we're gonna try and trap as much humidity in there as we can. All right guys, it's been 10 minutes and you can see how much bigger our dough has gotten already. So we're gonna roll it out, and I'm using my large cutting board this time because I don't want to cut on my tabletop. So I'm going to start working with about half of my dough. So I'm gonna roll out my dough until it's about 1/2 inch thick. And then I'm gonna use this wide mouth can ring, and I'm gonna cut my hamburger buns just like that. Now the trick to getting them nice and round is making sure you have enough flour down, because when you pull them up, if they're stuck to your cutting board, they're gonna become misshapen when you pull them up. Yeah, just like that. Let's get this one first. You can try and work with them and get them to get nice and round again. Then I'm gonna reuse this dough. I wanna be careful not to add too much more flour, because there's already a bunch of flour that I rolled into here. So I'm just putting enough flour down to keep the dough from sticking to my cutting board. So now that we've cut them all out, we're just gonna let them sit for 30 minutes and they're gonna rise. You can see these wonky ones. That was the end of my dough where I squished it all together and rolled it out. But this was the pan that I did first. So you can see how those have already risen more than these. So we're gonna just let them rest for 30 minutes. So our 30 minutes are up and we're gonna put these in a 375-degree oven for 10 minutes. So now that our timer's gone, we're gonna check them. They're a little toasty over the top, so I know they're getting close. But if you're unsure, you can always take the internal temperature. They're like at 188. 191, there we go. I wanna get them as close to 190 as I can. 190 is my desired temperature for bread. They look beautiful. At this point, you could brush them with butter and sprinkle some sesame seeds on them if you want to. Okay, the kids are home from school, and for a snack, I'm gonna cut open one of these fresh hamburger buns.
No, I wasn't.
Do you want honey or raspberry peach jam? You want honey too? Hadassah, do you want one? Oh, is it? It's so good. What are you having for a snack, Harrison?
Chips and salsa.
Salsa, salsa. Always salsa. Who made the salsa, Harrison?
You.
Is it your favorite salsa? Okay, since we're having burgers tonight, I thought I would real quick show how I make my hamburgers. So I've got 4 pounds of ground beef, and I'm gonna add 2 eggs, and I'm gonna add 2 teaspoons of salt. I'm gonna add a generous amount of black pepper. Black pepper is probably one of my favorite things to add to any dish. So you could do anywhere from 1 to 3 teaspoons. I probably have a good 3 or 4 teaspoons. The other thing I need is about 1/4 cup of flour. I'm gonna get that measured out. But first I'm gonna mix the egg into the meat. And what the egg and flour does, it helps your burgers stick together so they don't fall apart when you grill them. I'm gonna add about 1/4 cup of flour and see what happens. So now I'm gonna shape my burgers, and I know there is fancy things that you can use to shape your burgers. But I don't usually like to have more gadgets flying around in my kitchen cabinets than I have to have, just because I don't have a lot of cabinet space. So now you could put your burgers directly on the grill, or you can put them in the freezer until you're ready. I like to put ours in the freezer for a couple hours, just because they stay together on the grill a little better. So Elvin and Mitchell took over the grilling of the burgers for me. So inside the house, I am going to put some mayo on some of the fresh hamburger buns for the little boys. Since we have church tonight, we don't have a lot of time for supper, so I'm trying to get us a head start. So on tonight's hamburger, we have fresh garden tomatoes, sauteed onions, and sauteed kale, and then of course the condiments of everybody's choice. So that's it for this week's video. Thank you everybody for showing up and for all the love and support that you give us on our channel. Never in a million years would I have imagined that there would be so many of you that enjoy watching our everyday life. And we appreciate every one of you.